trend, but never mind, a good audience here, so that's good. We will record it and we may post it on YouTube, assuming everything goes smoothly and the recording is worthwhile. And if the speaker agrees and there are no copyright issues with slides and all the rest, so all the usual caveats. Now, will those attending on Zoom please make sure they're muted at all times unless called to speak? We have had very interesting interruptions of people eating their supper or having long conversations about what they're doing tomorrow and so forth. It does rather distract people. If anyone is watching has questions, please post them in chat and we'll pick them up later when we come to the discussion period, or we'll use the raise hand facility because that helps us detect who has a question. Mobile phones here particularly, please silent. I've just done mine, didn't last time. I've often thought we're a bit lax in telling you where the fire instructions are for this place, because it's a strange place to all of us, really, isn't it? And here we are, and we're not expecting this place to be on fire. If you're watching it online, then you'll be witness to the event if it does. But we're not expecting it to. The fire alarm is a continuous ringing sound, pretty normal. There's fire extinguishers around, not holding the doors open, so that's good. Break glass points, etc. The exit route is out of the door you came in, or most of us came in, up the stairs into the courtyard. And the assembly point is in Greenhill Rents, which apparently is right onto Cowcross Street, then right onto Greenhill Rents. I can't vouch for that, but I think it's correct. And after the meeting, Dan has arranged for a table for dinner with the speaker for 8, I think, at 8 o'clock around the corner. So if you would like to go, then please contact Dan afterwards. Now, our talk this evening is by Chris Mackay, who described himself as a horological historian. And after graduating at Sussex University, Chris spent 23 years in the electronics industry. And being made redundant, he fell into teaching technology in schools, ending up as the head of department in a top prep school. After that, he spent some years restoring turret clocks. He's always been interested in turret clocks and has produced the guidebook, the textbook, the Turret Clock Keeper's Handbook. And he's going to talk tonight about Edmund Beckett Denison, the father of Big Ben. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you. Right. What about the lights? Is that too bright, too much, or what? We're all happy? Okay.
Okay.
When I was 13, parents moved house to Greenford in West London. Being a keen cyclist for getting around, I got on the bike and I ended up in a little tiny branch library in Southall. And in that was a wonderful book. It looked as though somebody had played football with it. 1902, A Rudimentary Treatise by Clocks, Watches and Bells by Lord Grimthorpe. Earlier in his life, he was Edmund Beckett Denison. And then that was a fascinating description of turret clocks, which are the big things up church towers, and in particular, Big Ben, or the great clock at the Palace of Westminster, to give it its correct name. And I kept taking this out and taking it out, and I was thoroughly enthralled with that. So here we go. Let's try that one. Left, right, boom. Right. If you go up the tower, and the tours will be starting again sometime later on in the year, you will find along the bottom, it says Frederick Dent, maker to the Queen, from the designs of Edmund Beckett Denison, QC. He was a Queen's Counsel, an interesting character, and probably not the sort you'd really want to live next door to, as he was usually thought himself right on everything, and usually he was. This is a portrait of him. It's a, I didn't write it. I think it's a cabinet card. No, it's not. It's a carte de visite. and him as a young man, and that's his writing at the bottom. National Gallery, Creative Commons and all that. What we're going to do is go through his life history, and I'm going to try and tease out my view as to why he was the designer and what he did and what his input was. And like many people, it's probably some of the not so good aspects that meant that he actually came up trumps with a fantastic clock. Well, 1834, 16th of October, the Houses of Parliament caught fire, and they essentially burnt to the ground. All the somebody's phone went off. That's for me. Tell them I'll call them back. The whole place was destroyed except Westminster Hall, which all the fire brigades, which were a bit haphazard then, tried to save. And in one of his writings, there is a notebook he has, which is in the Beverley Record Office, and it's quite interesting. It's a sort of a school book, and it's got sort of Latin doggerel and bits of Greek and scribblings. And then obviously he picked this up at some stage and said, I ought to document what I've been doing in my life. And it was probably shortly after his marriage, well, it's probably about shortly after Big Ben was set going, that he wrote all of this down. And in there's some really interesting insights, like I went to Trinity College, Cambridge on the 16th of October, 1834, the day the Houses of Parliament were burnt down. And he was then 18 years old. You will probably be aware that Charles Barry was the architect eventually chosen to design the building, and he employed Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin. Now, if you take the Houses of Parliament be like a big Christmas cake, Charles Barry designed the basic cake, and Pugin put all the icing on, all the twiddly bits, all the decoration, from the tiles on the floor to the carved ceilings, to the curtains, to the windows, door handles, absolutely everything. And unfortunately, Pugin wasn't given any credit at all for this by Mr. Barry. So here's Barry's design, and you can see it's a bit plain looking, but basically that's that's what it was originally conceived to be. As I said, Pugin added the icing on, and you'll see there was a clock tower on the right hand side, and the government wanted a clock tower with a truly magnificent clock in it. So the clock tower there's a little bit on the skinny side, not very tall, but what we ended up with is this. Now, this is an album in print. It's probably the 1880s, I think. And Pugin designed the clock tower. We know this because there's a letter from Pugin to, I forget who it is, but it says, I'm so worn out, but I have now finished the designs of the clock tower for Mr. Barry. And it's an astonishing design. Now, I am no artist, but if you actually do a drawing of this clock, technical drawing of this clock tower, it's sort of a bit clumpish. But when it's taken from a distance, with the dials that project out a slight amount, this is interesting. Is that me? Someone's coming to. Huh? I'll turn this off for a moment. Turn this off. Still most of those in. I've turned it back on again. Shall I leave it off?
I'll turn it back on again.
It's on now.
I seem to have gone quiet.
Right. So this is an album in print of about the 1880s. And as I said, if you do a technical drawing of this, it's not terribly good. It doesn't look very aesthetic. But when you get away from it, and when the sort of honey color of the stone is there, and the white dials, it really starts to come to life. This is one of the secrets of art that I know nothing about. What we'll do now is we'll have a brief visit to the clock tower, so to see what the clock is like, and then we'll start exploring Edmund Beckett Denison's life and his background and all the influencing things that I thought were part of it. So if you go up the spiral staircase, there is something like 320 steps to get you up to the belfry. There is a place which is erroneously called the prison room. They now use for demonstration things, and visitors can have a rest there. The next thing you meet are the dials, and then you meet the clock room, and then out to the belfry. So here we are, lots of steps there. And the first place you really find of interest is behind the dials. Now, this picture I discovered in the London Metropolitan Archives, and it's by Mr. Hodsall, who was the roving camera, and it's 1905. And this is a very, very interesting picture because it's very early electric lighting. And you can see the inset on the right-hand side shows a Nernst lamp. And that is a piece of ceramic, which is suitably doped with a rare earth element. And then when it gets hot, its conductivity goes down and it starts to glow extremely white hot. Now, I think there's a bulb underneath it, which is probably some sort of ballast resistor. And I kind of guess the sort of meat safe hanging down is probably to keep the moths and the flies out, which would, a bit like an arc lamp, they'd go in and be cremated. But if you look at the picture on the left-hand side, you see there are rungs inside on the wall on the right. And this was so that the gasman could access the gas burners. And there was about 24 burners there. They were bat's wing burners. There was no mantles. It was very crude. And you can just see, I don't know how this works. Let's just try it. No. Down the bottom on the right, you'll see a gas pipe coming up. And then you might be able to make out some of the gas jets, which have been folded back against the wall. 22.5 feet diameter. So 312 bits of glass in there. And then at that time, the largest clock dials in the country. Into the movement now, into the clock room. And this is, it was installed in 1859, although it was ticking and running some years earlier. But in true, anyone in the government here, in true government fashion, there were lots of problems with building the tower. So here we are, and I think the next picture, no, what we've got is in the middle is what we call the going train that drives the dials. On the right, there is the quarter striking train that does the quarters, and on the left, the hour striking. The two big things up in the ceiling are flies, fly fans, and these regulate the speed of striking. Essentially, they're air brakes. And they're up there because as part of the general non-communication between the clockmaker and Barry, the architect, there was no room to put them behind the clock, which was the conventional way of doing it. The bits of gearing on top of that beam, there are two things there. There are bevel gears that drive off to the dials, and that rod that goes off to the right and the one that goes off to the left. Those turn around once an hour, and they drive the minute hands. And also there's another bit of engineering there called a double-barreled crab, which is a simple crane, and the clock mechanism, or movement to be techie, sits on top of the weight shaft that goes down 200 feet to the ground floor. And all the bits for the clock came up the weight shaft. And that was used for pulling them up. Now, the whole success of the clock, and I should back up a bit and say that George Biddle Airy, the Astronomer Royal, was taken on as a referee for the clock. And he came up with a specification, one bit of which said the first gong of the hour should be accurate to 1 second of time. Well, of course, all the clockmakers in Clerkenwell went, no, that's impossible, ridiculous. And they were used to turret clocks keeping time to possibly a minute a week. And Volamy tendered for, he didn't tender for the job, he expressed an interest. And Edward John Dent said, yeah, I can do it. And he did it in association with Edmund Beckett Denison. And one of the reasons is this, it's the escapement. It's called Denison's double three-legged gravity escapement. And what it does is it isolates the pushes to the pendulum by just giving it impulses of gravity. So one arm is lifted up, dropped on the pendulum, the other one's lifted up, dropped on the pendulum, and the impulses are always equal, whatever the weather is or the winds on the dial. And that was one of the key successes for the clock. And thanks to our IT man, there is a video here. This is just the going train of the clock. This is in Cumbria's, the Cumbria Clock Company's workshop. It's in Dacre, in the Lake District, and that's the escapement there ticking away. Quite some years ago, I was running a course. You want to see it again? Go back here. At the British Horological Institute for turret clocks, and some guys from the palace came along and they brought the escapement along with them. So it's a bit of a friend, really. Right, the pendulum. This is a massive thing, weighs about 600 pounds, solid block of cast iron. But the pendulum rod was designed by E.J. Dent, and it has a steel rod going down. It's got a zinc tube coming up, and it's got a steel tube going down, and the pendulum sits on that. And overall, the upwards expansion of the zinc counteracts the downward expansion of the steel, and it does not change with temperature. Those holes in the pendulum rod are supposed to let you let the air get in, but that's in a very sort of confined space. It's in a little box underneath the clock, and that on the left hand side is a wrought iron sheet. Wrought iron sheets for the thing, and if you jump up and down too hard, and if it's a bit rusty, you might find yourself at the ground floor because it's in the weight chute. Up a bit further, up to the belfry, and here's the Great Bell of the Palace of Westminster. That's a technical name for it, generally known as Big Ben. It was named after Sir Benjamin Hall, who was the Minister of Works at one of the times when it was being installed. So there are actually a couple of cracks in it. I think I've got pictures of that later on. Right. Now to the family and his background. Edmund Beckett Denison, he was the father. He started off as Edmund Beckett, and he married a lady called Maria Beverley. And part of the marriage settlement, which was the legal agreement between the two families as to who should put what money into the family, he took on the name Edmund Beckett Denison. And the Denison was the family name where Maria Beverley came from. Well, he was born here, which is a place called Carlton Hall at Carlton-on-Trent, just about 6 miles to the north of Newark in Nottinghamshire. His father rented the hall for a few years, and 1816, he was a May baby. Now, on the 31st of July, 1816, he was christened Edmund Mackenzie Sidmouth Beckett Denison at St Mary and St Nicholas, Beverley, the church where his parents were married. His father abode given as Beverley and profession as Esquire. The register notes, received into the church having been previously baptized by the Reverend Herring, curate of Norrell. That's spelt Norwell, but pronounced Norrell if you're up that area. Curate of Norrell Notts, St Lawrence Church, is about 2 miles from Carlton Hall. Well, he went off for some time to Doncaster Grammar School. Doncaster Grammar School was founded in 1350. So all the places he went to had great historical content to them. And he was there for how long, I don't know, when he went there. But by the time he was 12 years old, he left. And the building here, I'm afraid it's a bit out of context. It's 1869, and it's by G.B. Scott. It's actually now called Hallcross Academy, and it's on the eastern edge of Doncaster. I have tried doing some researching, but if anyone here has done researching, you know how difficult it is to get into a backwater or to find nothing after doing a lot of work, or something that's irrelevant after doing a lot of work. Well, he then moves on to the much younger Eton College, founded 1440. This is the quadrangle from the Penny magazine in 1833. In his sort of diary book, he wrote, I came to Eton May the 1st, AD 1829. And he was almost 13 years old. And he left Eton in 1832 when he was 16. And he went here. I went to Hodgson's at Bumstead. This is Hellion's Bumstead. And I stayed at Braisted. I don't know where Braisted comes in. When J. Hodgson got the living at Hellion's Bumstead. Hodgson was a fellow of Trinity, and the patrons of Hellion's Bumstead was Trinity College, Cambridge. So it was all, you know, very sort of incestuous or nepotism. So he was there for a couple of years, being tutored by Hodgson, along with about another 8 boys aged 16 to 18. And there's very, very telling things he wrote. Talking of the bells, he says, 2 recast, a new one were hung by me and the village carpenter. I used to spend near all my time there out of reading hours in carpeting and after mechanics. So he'd found this village carpenter, or the village carpenter found him. And anyone who's good with their fingers knows if they get an apprentice who's really keen, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. Now, one of the odd things about Edmund, he wasn't an easy guy to get on with, but he seemed to get on very well with craftsmen. And I don't know how he did it, but he did it. Trinity College, Cambridge, founded 1546, quite a young outfit. And he goes there. I went to Trinity College on the 16th of October, 1834, the day the Houses of Parliament were burnt down. And he stayed there and he read the mathematical treatise. And this picture here shows, I think this is the last student to get the wooden spoon. Now, the mathematical treatise, the person who got the bottom of the class was awarded a wooden spoon. And this is what Edmund wrote. It's quite a bit. In 1838, January, I took my degree. I was only 30th wrangler, lower a good deal than was expected. But I was never very ready in examinations, and especially those that consisted chiefly of what is called bookwork. The time that was given for problem papers, i.e. questions not in books, was absurdly short in proportion to the number of questions. It has since been altered, I think. However, the degree was of no particular consequence to me. I never expected to be higher than 12th or 15th, and except for my present satisfaction, the difference between that and the 30th signified very little, though above 10th every place is thought important. My father and I had long agreed that I'd better start reading law as soon as possible. As soon as I'd taken my degree, and not spend 2 or 3 years more in reading a fellowship, the value of which was of no consequence to me. And this made me the more careless, both about reading very hard before my degree and for the results afterwards. Again from his notebook. In August 1838, I put up the church clock in Bumpstead, the first I had to do with. It was made by Vulamy of London, then the best maker. And some notes here I've made. He gave a guinea to the fund, and it looks like he was the organizer of this collection for the clock and its installation. And a total understatement was, I had little expectation that my clockmaking and bell ringing would bear much fruit 20 years later. He also got involved in bell ringing here, and it looks as though the lads who are at Hodgson's with him went round churches ringing bells. He then went to Lincoln's Inn, founded 1228. Yes, that's the oldest one of our educational outfits. I stayed in Cambridge until 1839, reading law books, by which I picked up enough to prevent my first half year in my tutor's chambers being wasted, as it so often is. Being a scholar, I had the right to stay there, though I do not remember anyone doing so who was not either reading for a fellowship or taking pupils. I enjoyed that year very much. And he got a job as an equity draftsman and conveyancer. And he lived, first of all, in Great Russell Street, where the TUC Congress House was, then in Lincoln's Inn, and then he moved to Queen Anne Street when he got married. Now, he started off work with some business, financial business. What do they call it? Financial business. Anyhow, and it was a big complex case, and it was going very slowly, and he wasn't making any money. So he was advised by a friend to change to parliamentary bar work, which he did. And he very quickly became involved in railway bills. And it was the dot-com business of the time. Everyone wanted the railways to go through someone else's land. Chancery business, that's what I was trying to fumble on. Well, he got married in 1845. He married Fanny Catherine Lonsdale, who was the daughter of John Lonsdale, the 89th Bishop of Lichfield. And he was married here at Eccleshall, which was the seat of the Bishop of Lichfield. And then he moved to 31 Queen Anne Street, and Bishop lived round the corner in Harley Street. So if Fanny was getting fed up with husband, she could just pop round and get some comfort from mum and dad. Now, in 1850, this book came out, A Rudimentary Treatise on Clocks, Watches and Bells, 1850. And there were then 8 editions, and the last one was 1902. You can get it on the net, the 1902 version. And they're quite good because each edition has got a slightly different take in the main on the story of Big Ben. And this was a very successful book, and he wrote in a very untechnical way. It was easy to understand, and I don't know, somewhere he mentioned how many copies he'd sold of it, various editions, and it was in the thousands. But really, it was about the first easy to read book for anyone interested in clocks. Now, inside the book was a frontispiece, and the frontispiece is of the clock in Meanwood Church. Meanwood is sort of used to be a little leafy suburb of Leeds, and of course it's all morphed into Leeds now. And a couple of his aunts lived there, and they were building a new church. And of course, nephew Edmund was asked to design the clock, which he did. And this is what he came up with. And it was made by Edward John Dent, and it was installed in 1850. And it was a design, we call it a flatbed. The Vulamy clock I showed you is a cage frame, a bit of a pig to take apart. This is a flatbed where all the bits are mounted on a horizontal bed, and it is, in the main, a lot easier to deal with. Here is the actual clock in Meanwood. And this is one of the wonderful things about taking photographs and showing them to people afterwards. I looked at it, I thought, what on earth is that mess in the ceiling? Well, this clock had an awful lot of problems with the remontoire, which was a device to try and even out the power to the escapement. And those are all the sooty marks from the clockmaker's candles. And eventually this gave so much hassle, they took a hacksaw and they sawed off the offending parts and returned it all to what we could call a conventional clock with a pinwheel escapement. Now, this means that he was working quite closely with Edward John Dent. And hard on the heels of Meanwood comes this clock, 1851, shown at the Great Exhibition by Edward John Dent. And it was eventually installed in King's Cross Station, and the bed is still there. And part of the escapement is in the British Horological Institute near Newark. And why King's Cross Station? Well, who was the chairman of the Great Northern Railway? Well, Edmund Beckett Denison Senior. And so, of course, it seemed obvious that someone should have it, and he got it, designed by his son. Going back to the great clock at Westminster, it starts off by Benjamin Lewis Vallamy on the left, a wax portrait. He was a third-generation clockmaker to the Crown, and he was approached by Barry, would you do a clock for the great Houses of Parliament? And Vallamy said yes, and my fees are 100 guineas for the drawings, and if I don't get the job, another 100 guineas. So it took him a long time to produce the drawings, but then this guy on the right-hand side, Edward John Dent, said, I want to make the clock. There ought to be a competition or tenders. And Barry then got very uppity and said, I don't do tendering. And eventually Edward Dent tendered, and he got the job for making the clock at Westminster. Vallamy was very hurt about this. So here is George Biddle Airy, Astronomer Royal. Absolutely brilliant guy, red hot, sharp brain on everything. And he was asked to be a referee for the clock, and he came up with a specification. The first blow, the first dong of the hour, should be accurate to a second. And this is from Biddle's autobiography that was mostly written by his son, but it's a jolly good book. I had some correspondence with EDB about clocks. In 1851, I proposed that Mr. E.B. Denison should be associated with me. November 1851, Denison consented to join me in the preparation of the Westminster clock. 1852, February, we began to have little disagreements. However, on April the 6th, I was going to Madeira and requested him to act with full powers from me. 1853, in October, I expostulated with Denison about his conduct towards Sir Charles Barry. 1853, November the 7th, I resigned. George Biddle Airy, Astronomer Royal. So he wasn't an easy guy to get on with. I think Airy was a real rational guy, and if he could argue things through, whereas Denison was much more sort of bull at the gate and unfortunately usually right. I've got a little plaque inside my porch which a friend gave me. He says, I'm not big-headed, I just got better ideas. Right. So this is the plans that were produced. And they were reproduced inside the second edition of the A Rudimentary Treatise of Clocks, Watches and Bells. I won't go through anything in detail, but you'll notice bottom right-hand corner, there are two signatures, Airy and Denison. You remember, on cast into the clock frame, there's only one name as the designer, and that's Denison. And here's a plan view of it. And what you, just go back one a moment, you should be able to see, oh yes, at the back, there's a fly. That's when it was originally designed to be the flies behind the clock. And what happened is that Dent had to contact the Office of Works. The Office Works would then contact Barry, and Barry would contact the Office of Works, and the Office of Works would then go back to the clockmaker. So it really was a bit of a no-no for good communication. Right, the escapement went through several iterations, and although it's got Denison's name on it, I'm sure it was a joint development between Edward John Dent and his stepson, Frederick Ripon, who became Frederick Dent and took over the building of the clock after E.J. Dent died. And that's a four-legged escapement there. Most things aren't, you know, just flash pan inventions, poof. Very often yeah, perhaps there's a poof moment, but then it develops and it's improved and it's altered and so on. Well, the bell, he was also into bell ringing, was Denison, and he designed Big Ben, the Great Bell, which picked up its name after it was cast. And here we have it being cast at Warner's foundry. It was actually an iron foundry in Stockton-on-Tees. And that white stuff in the floor, that's a river of molten metal. So all those people in their fineries standing so close to it, they're probably getting a little bit of a roasting. He designed bells for Doncaster Church, and he specified an alloy with a bit more tin than bells normally have. This made it rather brittle. So here's a Big Ben number 1 here. Now he's only 7 foot tall, so the sort of miniature people is a typical Victorian trick to make things look really extra big. On the right hand side we have the cannons called Doncaster cannons that he designed, which was a much easier way of hanging bells than the normal cannons, which involve rather more ironwork. Well, the bell was brought to London. There were stories of it almost being lost at sea, but I can't find any documentary evidence for this, apart from a casual comment in people's articles. It was pulled up on a wooden stand, and it was bonged every day at midday. And unfortunately, one day it went bong, bong, da-da-da-dunk, da-da-da-dunk. It cracked. Why did it crack? I think it cracked for 2 reasons. The bell was too heavy. It was cast too thick. The cope, the bit on the outside that sets the outside profile of the bell, probably moved up a little bit. And it probably didn't take much more than 1/8 of an inch up to alter the thickness of the bell. Secondly, the hammerhead used to strike the bell was far too heavy. And then finally, the metal designed by Denison was too brittle. So they recast it. This time they recast it in Mears in London. And there's the bell coming, drawn by the 16 horses. It was taken up the weight shaft, and of course it had to go up first because the bells are above the clock. And there it is on its side being hauled up the tower. Now in 1859, just a few months after the clock was set going, it was noticed there were cracks in the bell. And you can see quite clearly there's one in the foreground of the bell. And as you go around a bit to the right, there's a big bit where a lot of bell metal has been hewn out to check how deep the crack is, which goes almost halfway through. And it goes from that big crater right the way down to the lip of the bell. Well, after a long time, they decided to turn the bell by 1/4 of a turn. This was Airy's idea. And they started it ringing again. This time they had some rubber buffers to hold the hammerhead off the bell, and they had a lighter hammerhead, and it rings till today. Now, I've read various reports of this, and there's some fairly tongue-in-cheek explanations, like the tone of the bell was not ruined. But if you listen to the bell, it goes doi oi 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 oi. There's what they call a doublet in it. There are two notes beating away together there, and I'm sure that is due to these cracks. I'm sure Denison and Mr. Taylor, the other bell referee, would not have allowed that if that came out in the original bell. Well, there were various court cases that Edmund was involved in of his own making. And the first one was Mears versus Denison, because he said rude things about the bells and rude things about Mears. And there was, he never got to court, but there was an out-of-court settlement. In 1862, Frederick Dent had died. And who had drawn up his will for him? Well, Edmund had. And after he died, the will could not be found. And one of the beneficiaries in the will was Edmund Beckett Denison, who was to inherit the clock factory. But Elizabeth Dent, which was Frederick's mother, contested the will and said that Frederick wanted the will to be burnt and torn up. He said, "Oh, Denison hassles me so much for it." And it went to court, and it was found in favour of Elizabeth Dent. So Edmund Beckett never got the clock factory. And there was a much more interesting case in 1881 when Denison, who was then Sir Edmund Denison, he wrote some rude things about the Steinbank, who was the successor to Mears. And one of the things was a thoroughly bad bell by a thoroughly bad founder. And there were 3 letters in the Times which were thought to be libelous. And it went to a court case, and it went to a court case with a jury. And eventually they found that 2 of the letters were libelous, but 1 wasn't. The next day, the solicitors for Steinbank said, "Oh, we won." But there was, no, Edmund got back as well to say, "I've said it before, and I've said it again. It was a thoroughly bad bell by a thoroughly bad founder." And that appeared in one of the letters that was not regarded as libelous. What was the significance of Big Ben to the clock making world? Well, first of all, the escapement. It produced a brilliant performance, and a turret clock with Denison's escapement compensation pendulum can turn in a rate of better than a second a week, and that is better than most regulators. And it also spawned off several other things. It popularized, top left, the compensation pendulum, a glazed illuminated dial center. I've mentioned his escapement on the right-hand side. The flatbed construction, bottom left, and the Westminster quarters then became popular. Originally, these came out of St Mary's Church in Cambridge, and of course, who went to Cambridge? EBD did, and also Airy was there as well. So both of them were familiar with these quarter tunes. Now, he wrote a book on Bishop Lonsdale. He was absolutely besotted with his father-in-law, to the extent he cut one of his father-in-law's favourite trees down one day, and the bishop had to retire to his study for half a day while he worked out his fury. He was into other things, clocks and locks, and this was what was meant to be an unpickable lock. I'll briefly try and explain it. You put the key in and turn it, and that then depresses the various levers, and then all the slots lined up, so the bit on the right-hand side of the bolt can be shot into it. And you do that by turning the handle at the bottom. You can then remove the key, and then that sort of thing at the back, which looks like 2 Catherine wheels, is actually springs, and the keyhole is then locked. So you can't get in and sort of check the height of the various tumblers. And then when you want to shoot the lock, you just turn the handle, the bolt shoots into the thing, and the bit on the left-hand bottom raises all these tumblers to the right size. keep thinking I'd like to make a model of this, but of course, life is so busy. The British Horological Institute, sorry, I don't know what happened then, was founded in 1858, and he was elected president in 1867. And there's a lovely description in the Horological Journal of a meeting he attended. They had a prize giving, and the best finish for that and the best escapement, all this sort of stuff. And he was invited to talk about the history of the institute, which he did. And this is what he said. He slowly took everything apart, gave to members in the large room of the Society of the Arts. Excuse me. He was talking about clocks, and he says, Americans beat us in making watches. French clocks are in every drawing room, and American ones in every kitchen, and Austrian ones on many halls, and Swiss watches in everybody's hands, and in many gentlemen's as well. And then he went on to say, and he's got a lovely phrase coming up, if I can find it. Here we are, we're giving prizes. I've got a lot of text here. Down. Prizes, why? For polishing screw heads and the flat sides of wheels and things of that kind. Some of you may remember my laughing at a meeting of the Institute of the importance attached to facing pinions. And I asked, and I ask again, and you can feel the tension building up when he comes out with this. And I ask again, how many people in England have the most remote idea whether the pinions of their watches are faced or not, and even what it means? And what is more important, will any man in the room venture to say that such a watch will go the smallest degree better or worse, whether its pinions are faced or not, whether the wheel faces are polished or the screw heads left grey? And he almost got thrown out of the Institute as a result of this. But I'm afraid what he said was absolutely true. And he came up with an expression called working for fools. And working for fools is where you polished everything up on a clock. In the great clock at Westminster, if it wasn't something that pushed or shoved or turned, it was painted. So arbors of wheels were painted. There was no polishing. He was also into building. Said of himself, I am the only architect with whom I have not quarrelled. And you start to get an idea what he's like. This is his house at Batch Wood, which is he built just outside St Albans. And to put that in context, the postcard of the building and the clock tower, it's a very severe building. Sophia Lonsdale, his niece, said, he built himself about a mile from the town, solid and ugly, but comfortable. The furniture was solid and beautifully made, but ugly too. On the clock tower, we don't have any Roman chapters. We just got battens, because he said, people don't need the Roman numerals. They know where they are, and all they need is a decent batten to see with a picture of the hand. Astronomy Without Mathematics was another one of his books. He was also the Vicar General of the Diocese of York, which I think like the Chancellor. He was anti-evangelical and anti-Oxford movement, and very much middle of the road. And once he was asked what was his position, he said, I am a man of violent moderation. He took under his wing St Albans Abbey, which he had restored. That's his West End. And it's sort of a bit like Disney. And this gave the rise to the phrase, the word Grimthorpe in the Oxford Dictionary. He was then Lord Grimthorpe. And it means to remodel, brackets, an ancient building, close brackets, without proper knowledge or care to retain its original quality and character. Well, it was, I believe, falling down. So he really did sort of save it. But this is the rose window in the south transept, and Sophia, his niece, writes, one awful window he designed was in the north transept. Sorry, Chris, got that the wrong way around. It's very big. Uncle G had megalomania, and it is designed with rounds of different sizes. The design was made from a 5-shilling piece, half crown, florins, shillings, sixpence, and a 3-penny piece. St. Peter's Church in St. Albans, you walked in there one day and said, I'm going to restore this. And I must go down there one day because there was a lovely plaque inside the church cast in brass. And it says something like, the parishioners of this church wish to record that the restoration was done by Lord Grimthorpe. And it's what it didn't say is what it really says. Now, once again, we have a dial here with battens only. In 1886, he was elevated to the peerage by the Prime Minister of the time, Lord Salisbury. Of course, he was a Conservative. And he became Lord Grimthorpe after a farm in Yorkshire that was owned by the family, where there was once a Lord Grimthorpe back in medieval times. And the right-hand picture is by Spy of Vanity Fair. The left-hand side is, of course, his coat of arms. And Spy, which is a pretty satirical sort of job, said, he is so high in authority on church architecture that he is credibly reputed to know the difference between a gargoyle and a flying buttress. Chronometer maker E.T. Lusby described Denison as a skunk, which has a method of fighting so offensive, repulsive, and inglorious that most persons, out of regard for their reputation and the taint which that creature lives behind, feel somewhat ashamed of being in contest with one of them. One thing that happens when you research people, you start to understand them, you get inside their head, and then something happens to you, and you end up starting to look like them. When he was supporting homeopathy, it's said that he was never so happy in the House of Lords when he was putting up the backs of the bishops. And one of the things he did argue about was margarine, which you could apparently at that stage, you could put butter substitute on a label where the butter was in huge letters and substitute you could hardly read. We're getting there. This is a pastoral portrait of him in the BHI Museum, and on the left there is a marble bust of him, which is in the north transept of St Albans Abbey. And in 2018, 130 years later, there was a Harris hawk named Denison at the Houses of Parliament. They use hawks to scare the pigeons away. Right. He said once, the ideal committee consists of 2 people, myself as chairman and the second member as an absentee. And I got that from the Honourable Oliver Beckett, which was one of the family. And this is Sophia Lonsdale, his niece. He was so far away the man of the most powerful intellect I've ever known. He was very nice to me, said to have taken a watch apart and put it back together when he was 5, and it worked. He had no sympathy with sports or games of any sort. His recreation was science, mathematics, or carpentry. For he was a very good carpenter and used to retire to a carpenter's bench with carpenter's cap and apron. I remember Mr. Pember, the KC, saying that he disliked walking in London with him because he used to produce an apple from his pocket and gnaw at it as he walked along and spit all the peel out over me. Well, towards the end of his life, he said, I don't have any friends and all my enemies are dead. And he spent the last few years making codicils to his will. And that meant there had to be an agreement between all the beneficiaries as to what the will really meant. He died in 1905 from heart failure, and he left about £2 million in 1905. Wow. And this is all the result of his work as a QC, producing railway bills to go through Parliament. Here he is, he's buried in St Albans Abbey. All the shops in St Albans closed on the day of his funeral. And Sophia Lonsdale, that's his niece, names her horse Contention as a new horse, because everyone in the will had to come to an agreement. Well, he left some money to Trinity College, Cambridge. And he wanted new bells, new clock, new dials. Well, the fellows wouldn't have his dials with buttons on, so they arranged to have the old dials used, and they couldn't do anything with the dials, so they ran out of money spending it on the clock and the bells. And here is the clock, very unusual. It's got 4 trains to drive the dial, striking the quarters, striking the hour, and there's a second train that strikes the hour again after about half a minute, and it's meant to strike the hour for Trinity and then the hour for St John's, the neighbouring college that doesn't have a clock. When we start taking Mr. Denison or Lord Grimthorpe apart, we come to this guy who Hans Asperger, who was an Austrian doctor who studied children and identified behavioural issues, with ending up with something called Asperger's syndrome, which is basically it's sort of high-level functioning autistic related behaviours. But the Asperger's syndrome apparently has been de-emphasised due to his connection with the Nazi regime, which seems a bit sad that he should be tarred with that. Who's had Asperger's in the past? Well, a whole load of them. And here we've got Henry Ford, Einstein, Isaac Newton, Henry Cavendish, Marie Curie, Paul Dirac. And what I've done is put down here the score. You can check to see if you've got Asperger's. You get online and there's a tick list. If you've got more than about 4 out of 10, you're in. Odd behaviour, obsession with some subjects, really intense obsession, poor interpersonal skills, poor eye contact, doesn't conform with social norms, very intelligent, doesn't make friends, has a strict routine and has favourite foods. And all of those I can justify from various historical sources. So we're almost there now. I submit to you that Edmund definitely had Asperger's syndrome. And I think it was this that enabled him to create the great clock and bells at the Westminster. So thank you, Asperger's. Without you, Big Ben would have never been so successful. And if it wasn't for Edmund, and if it wasn't for Asperger's, and Edmund just ploughing ahead and making it all happen, then you probably find there'll still be a House of Commons committee arguing about what the clock was going to be today. Finally, he inherited some of his father's nature. An obituary of his father that appeared in a newspaper was somewhat damning. He was moulded by the deeply traditional and historical education he had. He was influenced by the traditional Church of England, and he was a native of Yorkshire. That might have had something to do with it. So we're back to where we started, made to the designs of Edmund Beckett Denison QC, and believe me, it's a jolly good clock. Now, if you want to have another lecture about the restoration of Big Ben, here's my friend Keith Scobie-Youngs of the Cumbria Clock Company. Currently, he's not here because he's doing a talk to the British Horological Institute in Cheltenham. Here we go. This is a book I published, or OUP published in 2010. It started off life at £40 and it's crept up to 67. And I make no apologies for that. OUP does their own pricing policy. But that is I would say it's a good history of the great clock. And there's only a couple of things have been discovered since the book has been published. So we end up, yeah. And that, dear visitors, is it.